simultanea in inglese, francese e italiano. E questo incontro è trasmesso anche in streaming, che consente a chi non ha potuto essere qui fisicamente in ogni caso di seguirlo. Vorrei ringraziare la Commissione e in particolare il direttore Sergio Cofferati, che è qui con noi, Alain Beckers, per il contributo che ci daranno a questa discussione molto importante, che hanno dimostrato di considerare con la dovuta attenzione e con la loro presenza. Ringrazio anche tutti gli altri oratori, le figure accademiche che sono qui, i giornalisti, i rappresentanti del settore privato, della società civile, che discuteranno con noi di questo tema abbastanza inusuale, ma molto importante e particolarmente delicato per il futuro. Un ringraziamento particolare lo voglio dare a Idrissa, che è arrivato fin qui al Niger per poter discutere. Grazie da voi. Abbiamo organizzato questo incontro con il collega Durand, con Evelyn Reckner. Evelyn non può essere qui perché è stata richiamata in Austria per un impegno politico per il quale non poteva mancare. Mi ha chiesto di scusarla, cosa che faccio, e di in ogni caso confermarvi il suo interesse per gli argomenti che affronteremo. Volevo solo fare qualche breve osservazione prima di cominciare la discussione e di dare la parola al direttore del Colombia. Come sapete, il Fondo Monetario Internazionale classifica 51 paesi in cui abitano più di 1,5 miliardi di persone come paesi ricchi di risorse. La maggior parte di questi stati sono paesi in via di sviluppo. Anche altri paesi in via di sviluppo sono potenzialmente ricchi di risorse naturali come combustibili, fossili e minerali, che hanno il potenziale di risollevare milioni di persone dalla povertà in questi paesi. I paesi ricchi di risorse sono però spesso colpiti dalla cosiddetta maledizione delle risorse. Il titolo del nostro incontro è proprio questo. E lo abbiamo scelto per dare l'idea di quel che capita in questi paesi, che spesso hanno meno crescita economica, meno democrazia, peggiori tendenze di sviluppo e ancora di più conflitti frequenti. Molti di questi paesi hanno contemporaneamente una straordinaria povertà e una potenziale altrettanto straordinaria ricchezza delle loro risorse. Per battere questa maledizione, la cosa più importante, secondo me, è la trasparenza. Trasparenza che riguarda tutti i soggetti istituzionali, politici o economici che lavorano in questi settori. Bisogna assicurare che i proventi generati dallo sfruttamento delle risorse naturali siano usati per il vantaggio del numero più ampio di persone e non siano invece sottratti all'uso comune da azioni corruttive, da abusi fiscali o da cattiva gestione. La società civile chiede da tempo maggior trasparenza in aree chiave della rendicontazione delle imprese come strumento per migliorare la responsabilità dei governi e delle imprese operanti del settore estrattivo. È un tema che anche il Parlamento, sul versante delle politiche fiscali, ha affrontato più volte, soprattutto nel corso degli ultimi anni. Nello specifico, maggior trasparenza delle imprese del settore estrattivo costituirà uno strumento essenziale nella lotta alla corruzione, agli abusi e alla cattiva gestione, conquistando la fiducia del pubblico e supportando lo sviluppo dei paesi ricchi di risorse. Nel 2013 l'Unione Europea ha approvato un nuovo strumento legislativo con l'obiettivo di aumentare la trasparenza dell'industria estrattiva. La legge europea si basa sulle iniziative sulla trasparenza delle industrie estrattive, con l'impegno volontario di 51 paesi a promuovere la gestione aperta e trasparente, in particolare delle risorse petrolifere, minerarie e del gas. Le nuove misure sono state introdotte nelle direttive sulla trasparenza e sulla rendicontazione e impongono alle imprese estrattive registrate e quotate nell'Unione Europea, come peraltro è obbligo per altre aziende, di rendere pubblici i pagamenti che fanno i governi anno per anno e progetto per progetto. Tali misure, se applicate correttamente, aumenteranno la trasparenza, favoriranno una gestione responsabile delle risorse e il comportamento dei governi nei paesi ricchi di risorse. Il Parlamento europeo ha avuto un ruolo importante, si potrebbe dire addirittura chiave nell'approvazione delle misure del 2013, a fronte di resistenze esterne che non sono mancate. Quelle misure hanno aumentato la trasparenza per le industrie estrattive, combattendo la resistenza di molti Stati membri e soprattutto le fortissime spinte lobbistiche contrarie ai provvedimenti. Arlene McCarthy, la nostra ex collega, ha giocato un ruolo chiave in questo senso, con un coraggio del quale credo sia giusto da parte mia oggi darle atto. Stiamo seguendo l'applicazione della direttiva con attenzione, come stiamo seguendo il processo di verifica e di revisione delle norme che al momento è in corso. Tutto questo vale per i rapporti economici e finanziari delle imprese ed è uno degli elementi chiave di un'idea non soltanto di buone pratiche nei paesi interessati, ma anche di concorrenza leale tra i paesi e tra le imprese. La trasparenza serve anche a questo. Io spero che oggi la discussione, anzi ne sono convinto, ci consentirà non soltanto di richiamare e approfondire quel che abbiamo fatto nel settore estrattivo con le norme adottate nel 2013, ma anche di discutere sui primi risultati che sono stati raggiunti, sulle valutazioni che vengono date dell'esperienza e sui miglioramenti eventuali da introdurre nelle norme legislative per il futuro. È molto importante per questo capire anche come sta procedendo il processo di analisi delle norme e di eventuali revisioni che la Commissione europea sta portando avanti. Per questo siamo molto contenti di avere qui con noi oggi i due rappresentanti della Commissione europea, che ricordavo prima e con i quali discuteremo gli argomenti di oggi. Per cominciare questa discussione sono molto contento, come vi ho anticipato, di dare la parola a Eric de Colombier, che è a capo dell'unità per le relazioni interistituzionali ed è anche il direttore facente funzione per le aree di investimenti e rendicontazioni della Direzione Generale per la Stabilità Finanziaria. Lo ringrazio ancora molto per la sua presenza di oggi e gli cedo la parola. Prego.
Grazie, signor Cofferati. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure for me to be here today to kickstart, to launch your conference and to give you an update about the EU's efforts to introduce more transparency on the payments made to governments by companies which are active in the extractive and forestry sectors. There are about 80 countries in the world which have abundant prized natural resources such as oil, minerals, forests, or precious stones. These countries often base their economic development on the export of these resources, which represents for them significant revenues. If well managed, these revenues could be a great opportunity for the economic and social development of these producing countries. However, natural resources are often located in countries with a low human development index, with a high level of corruption, with a weak legal framework, and law enforcement. As a result, these revenues generated from the extraction may not always benefit directly to the population, often even less so to local people and local communities. And this is the resource curse that we are all about to discuss today. So let me give you a few words about what we have done to address this curse. 5 years ago, the EU and the US joined their efforts in order to make a first step towards eradicating this curse on a global scale. And we did so using a very powerful tool, which is transparency. But let's be clear, with transparency alone, this curse will not be beaten, to use again the expression in the title of today's conference. Nevertheless, transparency is, we believe, a decisive step among the many initiatives which are needed to address this curse. There is, as I said, no reason to believe that transparency alone can be the solution. So our initiative has to be appreciated in a wider, broader framework of initiatives which have been taken by the EU. I will mention a few. First, the Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Action Plan, the FLECT, as it is called, which is from 2003. Also the EU Timber Regulation, which came into force in 2013. And also our engagement in many relevant multilateral fora, such as the UN Forum on Forests, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the International Tropical Timber Organization. We are actively contributing to the discussions in these various fora. And there is also, last but not least, the what we call the conflict minerals regulation, which was adopted in May of last year. So, 5 years later, as I said, as Mr. Cofferati said, the EU initiative was adopted in 2013. So 5 years later, I think it is fair to say that transparency has become a reality, but maybe not perfect, still recent, but nevertheless a reality. But there is a key question. Did we achieve our intended objectives? In other words, are people in resource-rich countries now more able to hold their governments to account? And that's precisely what you are here to assess today. We are engaged in our own assessment. We started our own assessment, and we are working hard on that question. We have launched a broad public consultation between March and July this year, in the context of our, in the wider frame of our fitness check on the EU legal framework on public reporting by companies. So in other words, we started a very broad exercise of checking the relevance, fitness, or purpose of our company reporting framework and among issues which we are looking at is the issue we are here to talk about. So we have hired a contractor, a consortium of companies that are collecting evidence for us on this very subject. Maybe some of you have been in contact with them, and we, of course, thank you for having been in contact with them, and we will, when the results of this fitness check are, let's say, completed, we will report to the European Parliament and to the Council, and that will be around the middle of next year. So it will take time for us to examine all this evidence and to report to the then new Parliament and soon to be new Commission in order to enable them perhaps to take some further actions. But let me give you perhaps a sneak preview of the initial findings. I mean, we believe, based on the evidence that so far are available, that our policy is overall working fine, but are ways of improvement, which is inevitable with innovative policies. Just to name a few issues, which could be issues for concerns to be addressed by policymakers in the future. It is not always easy to get hold of the reports. Joint ventures, project definitions can vary from one country to the other and can be interpreted in various ways, which means sometimes unequal reporting frameworks. Also, some companies provide detailed information to the governments to which they make a payment. Others do not. So, another problem is the scope of application. It doesn't seem to be as broad as I'm sure some of you would have expected it to be, with respect notably to the logging sector. As you know, the EU rules targeted covered primary forests, and this notion of primary forest is maybe construed differently, which may tend to again uneven reporting outcomes. But these are still early days. However, the knowledge of these reports and how to use them is not yet as widespread as one would hope. Also the extent of their use of these reports depends very much on the openness of the political system in the country of operation, and also of the freedom of civil society in these countries to hold governments to account. But I would not like you to only believe that there are only areas for improvements. There are also very positive benefits that we can already observe. On the basis of the sample that we have, that have been examined, it appears that most companies, which would be covered by these rules, most companies have provided the required information. And it is our belief, and based also on the discussions we've had, that civil society organizations are optimistic that the influence of the reports will increase over the next 3 to 5 years, once more reports become available. Also, another positive thing is that we have not found any evidence that these rules would affect companies' competitiveness, as was often claimed by some of them. We found no evidence that it has been the case. Finally, as again has been highlighted by Mr. Cofferati, we have a natural synergy between this initiative and the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, a global initiative. So there is synergy, there is interaction between the two initiatives, and this is in our view, an excellent outcome. And all this will be, as I said, examined much more thoroughly in the report that we are going to prepare and which will become available in the course of next year. Just a few words also on the international scene, because of course this EU efforts cannot be seen in isolation. It's a very laudable effort, but of course we're not the only player in this world, and we would like others to take similar responsibilities. So we, with the Commission, continue to support the agenda of widespread transparency in the sector, so that what we've done can be done on a global scale to an even larger portion of extractive activity. Let me take a few examples. Canada, they implemented in 2015 their Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act, the ESTMA, and it's a good example of the EU and Canada having worked together to recognize each other's requirements as equivalent, which makes the system much smoother for global companies. What about the US? As you may know, they have decided, time being, to postpone transparency for their companies. But as we all know, in the Dodd-Frank Act, which is still in force, there is a section 1504, but as I'm sure many of you know, SEC rules are still necessary to have this section of the Act applied. And so far, in circumstances that I'm not going to comment in detail, but so far it's not the case. These rules are still missing. But this is, I can tell you, this is an issue that we, Commission, are discussing with the US at the highest level. It's an issue which our Vice President, Grostis, has discussed with his counterparts, notably the SEC, quite recently. So let's keep our fingers crossed and let's continue to follow this actively. And the EU, we also support both politically and financially the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EITI, which I mentioned before. We are an active member of the board of the EITI, and we really encourage countries which are rich in natural resources to join this initiative. As has been also said by Mr. Cofferati today, we are pleased to see that there are 51 countries which are implementing the EITI commitments. Good, of course, we are working on enlarging this community of countries. So I will conclude now. The least I can tell you today is that despite a few teething problems maybe and a few areas that we might have to address in the future, this country-by-country reporting is, for us, we are convinced, it's already a game changer for giving your views about it. Companies overall are playing by the rule. Civil society now has a tool with detailed information per project that includes payments in kind and that lists the recipient governments. These reports, they depict to the local population what is happening around them with enough details to hopefully enable these local population to speak to their government, even though we appreciate that they would probably rely on NGOs to speak on their behalf. Another thing we are observing is that dialogues or embryos of dialogues are taking place or can take place at any time with the government and also with companies, which is something we have also observed. Companies seem to be increasingly aware that they need to engage more proactively with their workforce and with their local communities to assess the economic and wider social benefits that their operations bring. In the end, and I will finish on this, perhaps the most important achievement is that CBCR is changing the mindsets in the resources-rich countries. So he said we will provide more details on these important topics in the forthcoming reports and staff working document. And the Commission intends to publish in June of next year in the context of this fitness check, which I mentioned before. So I wish you very constructive, interesting, fruitful discussions today. I will not be able to stay, unfortunately. I will stay for the keynote speech for Mr. Burgess, and I will have to leave you, but I will leave you with in the hands of very able colleagues of mine, Paul Fred to my left, and Alain Descartes, the head of the company reporting unit, who will be an active member of panel 2 in your discussions today. So I was very pleased and honored to have been given the chance to open your discussions today. Thank you again, the European Parliament, for the invitation and for this excellent initiative. Thank you very much.
Grazie a lei, dottor De Colombier. Come lei stesso ha anticipato, adesso do la parola a Tom Burgess, che è un giornalista investigativo del Financial Times, è autore del libro La macchina del saccheggio, che ha portato giustamente molti riconoscimenti, che ha aiutato tutti noi a comprendere i meccanismi dei quali stiamo discutendo e soprattutto ci ha dato poi conoscenze utili a creare strumenti per contrastare tutto ciò che di negativo si è mosso nel corso di questi anni. Siamo molto contenti e onorati che sia qui con noi questa mattina e che aiuti anche questa ulteriore fase di ricerca, di valutazione degli effetti che si sono determinati e di ricerca sui punti di sviluppo e di implementazione che per il futuro dovranno essere messi in campo sul versante delle istituzioni europee. Dunque, prego a lei la parola.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cofferati. Just before I start, I think we should just briefly salute those among us who recently spent time in prison as part of this struggle for their courage. Thanks for inviting me to speak. As you'll see, we have a few photos to lighten the load as we go. I apologise, I couldn't find a briefcase of euros, but this makes the point, I feel. On December the 1st, 2010, $1 million, possibly in a suitcase, possibly in some other mechanism, passed from a burly, bearded mining investor to a reclusive politician in the Congolese capital, Kinshasa. That was followed 2 days later by another 2 million, and then another 2 million on the 7th of December, and another on the 9th. After the new year, into 2011, the start of an election year in the Democratic Republic of Congo, came 2 more payments, one for $3 million and one for $750,000. Over the same period, 4 payments totaling just over $2 million went from the same bearded mining investor to this politician's advisor. At the same time that these payments were being made, I was a correspondent in Africa, and I was in Eastern Congo. It's a part of the world, as we know, that hasn't known peace for 2 decades, and people were starving. I travelled out to a remote part of the South Kivu province and to visit a hospital. It had crumbling yellow walls, we have a picture of it. And the raiding parties from the local army units had left it very short of supplies. This was the only hospital serving 160,000 people. In the pediatric ward of this hospital. There were 14 beds, and on each of them sat one or two mothers, each holding a baby. Some of the babies were just skin and bones, and some were just as malnourished, but they were bloated by edema. On one of these beds, there was a woman called Bora Sifa. She was 20, and she was looking around warily. She made about $1 a day, helping to cultivate cassava on beautiful green hillsides. She'd been eating so little that she'd stopped producing enough milk to feed her infant son, who was called Chance. His growth seemed to have halted, so she brought him to the hospital. Like many starving children, Chance looked like he'd aged prematurely. His eyes were sunken in his face and his hair was receding. He and Bora Sifa lived in an outhouse not far from the hospital. They dared not go back to their home village. 2 years earlier, one of the militias that roamed the region had descended on Bora Sifa's settlement. They were members of the organisation that had carried out the genocide in Rwanda across the border years before, and now they were terrorising eastern Congo. They made some money from supplying coltan, the raw material that goes into making mobile phones. But occasionally these militia groups also ransacked villages to supplement their income. The raiders came to Bora's village and they ordered her husband to gather up whatever they wanted, and they forced him to carry these things away into the forest, and then they killed him. The hospital lay about as far from Kinshasa as we are today from Minsk. Bora Sifa's life would seem to have precious little to do with the political intrigue in the capital. But those secret payments are a crucial part of what condemns Bora and Chance and millions more Congolese to deprivation and to violence. And we now know who was making those payments and who was receiving them. The politician was Joseph Kabila. He's been president of Congo since 2001 when he succeeded his assassinated father, Laurent. The advisor was Augustin Katumba Mwanke, the Rasputin of Congolese politics, and the gatekeeper to a bounty of mineral resources that includes some of the world's richest deposits of coltan and copper, as well as diamonds and gold. As for the big bearded mining investor, that was Dan Gertler. I have a picture of him too. Gertler's an Israeli billionaire, and he's a close friend of both Kabila and the late Katumba. Dan Gertler has amassed mining interests in Congo that have made him a billionaire, as I say, and he insists he's done so cleanly, even after the payments that I spoke about were listed in a court filing by American prosecutors in 2016 that made it easy to figure out the identity of the payer and the payee. Gertler does not operate alone. These connections that he spent so long cultivating would be worthless without intermediaries to connect him to global markets. His biggest business partners are two major multinationals, both of them based in Europe. One is ENRC, the Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation, founded by three Central Asian oligarchs. This is one of them, Patok Shodiev, a long-time resident here in Belgium. At the time Gertler was making the payments to Congo's rulers, ENRC was listed in London and was one of the 100 biggest companies on the London Stock Exchange. It delisted in 2013 after the British Serious Fraud Office opened a corruption investigation into ENRC, which included its African operations, its Congolese operations. The company's lawyers say it's done nothing wrong, and today its successor company operates from Luxembourg. Gertler's other partner in Congo is Glencore, run by this man, a very wealthy man, Ivan Glasenberg. Glencore operates from the delightful Swiss town Zug. It's also a member of the FTSE 100 most valuable London-listed companies. It's the most powerful trader of commodities in the world and mines those commodities itself all over the planet. Last year it paid Dan Gertler $500 million to buy him out of their shared ventures in Congo and put some distance between. An American organisation that I'm sure people here will have come across, called Trace International, has examined all the bribery cases brought by prosecutors around the world over the past 40 years and separated them by sector, by the broad industry to which they related. Pharmaceuticals accounted for 2% of bribery cases. Financial services were 5%, aerospace, defence and security were 12%. And the extractive industries, oil and mining, the ones we're talking about today, accounted for 22% of detected corruption. If you put that another way, for every 5 bribes, one of them greases an oil and mining deal. In practice, this means that people like Bora Sifa, who have the misfortune to be born somewhere that has valuable commodities under its soil, are cursed. Not only does the export of those commodities choke off manufacturing and other industries that could provide widespread formal employment, these riches also have a far more insidious effect. They concentrate wealth in the hands of the gatekeepers for those resources, those who capture the state, usually through kleptocracy underpinned by violence, and set it to serve their own interests. This is why when you go to Nigeria, where I've lived for a few years, the biggest exporter of energy in the form of oil and gas in Africa, the National Electric Power Authority, or NEPA, is instead known as Never Expect Power Anytime. That is until it was recently rebranded as the Power Holding Company of Nigeria, or PHCN, which is known as Please Have Candles Nearby, or simply Problem Has Changed Name. Those who derive their power from the dark money that flows from the resources trade enjoy impunity. They have no need of popular consent to rule, no need to raise taxes. That impunity is now sufficient to stretch beyond borders. I would wager that Jamal Khashoggi and Sergei Skripal will be unharmed today if the autocrats they crossed did not enjoy access to the ultimate source of corrupt power, petrodollars. The rulers of these states have a compact not with their people, but with the oil and mining companies themselves and with the global resources markets. When the killers who come to villages like Bora Sifa's in eastern Congo arrive, they pass unhindered because the state is not there to protect them. It's been put to another purpose, the sharing of the spoils. This is what I called the looting machine in my book. A handful of resource-rich countries have dodged this curse because they were lucky enough to have functioning institutions in place before the toxic resource revenues and attendant bribes started to flow. Norway is an example of this, although its state oil company, its leading oil company, has been willing to do business in countries that do not enjoy such defences, such as Angola. Most states have no institutional defences to protect them from this. Indeed, they were still colonies, many of them, when the resource industry took control of them, such as Congo. Today, these shadow states where petrodollars are corruption and, where petrodollars are the currency and corruption is the law, have grown into transnational networks, and this I think is a vital point to understand. Hundreds of billions of dollars in illicit wealth sits in Western banks and property masquerading as legitimate riches. There's an entire industry devoted to this metamorphosis. There are art dealers, PR professionals, accountants. Real estate agents are a particularly important cog in this laundry. Indeed, the current US president made part of his career being just that. There are libel lawyers to muzzle the press, corrupt journalists and mercenary propagandists to doctor the public record. Then there are the spies. In London and Paris and Berlin and 100 other cities, private spies work to scrub clean their clients' pasts and to dig up their enemies' secrets. In Kazakhstan, where the proceeds of selling oil and uranium have created a model kleptocracy, President Nursultan Nazarbayev's regime has deployed dozens of spies for hire to pursue, monitor, hack and intimidate his enemies in the West. There are no red lines here. When Nazarbayev's agents located the 6-year-old daughter of an exiled dissident oligarch in Rome, they kidnapped her. A few days ago, I spent the morning with a former very senior official in Nazarbayev's government. He sees the actions of the Kazakh kleptocracy as part of an emerging global trend. He said this: the war against corruption is becoming a political tool. I put it a slightly different way. Since the end of the Cold War, such is the volume of dirty money that has flowed not just into the global financial system, but into national political systems, that corruption is becoming the most important determinant of power. In Malaysia, in Brazil, in China, and Saudi Arabia, ruling cliques are fighting power battles with the internal secrets of their kleptocracies as weapons. At the same time, globalized corruption, a great deal of it fueled by dirty money from the extractive industries, is bringing about alignment of interests between different regimes. To my mind, that's the best way to understand Donald Trump's relationship with Putin. They're united by their shared values. This is something I and the rest of the investigators team of the FT have spent a long time on recently, tracking the financial flows between these two regimes. They're united by their shared values, the values of a kleptocrat. The fight back fought by many people in this room has been accelerating in recent years. We've moved beyond just disclosure of numbers in regimes such as those we're discussing today, to pushing for, I think, the potentially much more powerful disclosure of names, such as in the promising campaign for public registries of beneficial owners. Magnitsky Acts have proliferated. These are the pieces of legislation named in memory of a Russian lawyer beaten to death in custody after exposing an enormous tax scam and punished by the petrodollar-fueled regime in the Kremlin. These pieces of legislation allow governments to impose financial sanctions on those who violate human rights anywhere, and last year Dan Girdler, who we met earlier, was added to the US list. But there are two dangers in relying on this kind of tool. First, it creates a powerful new mechanism for turning leaks from inside a kleptocracy into financial penalties. These may indeed weaken some kleptocratic regimes, but in others they'll just strengthen one faction over another. And they reinforce this emerging system that I mentioned that weaponizes information in the struggles among the corrupt. And secondly, while the targets of these Magnitsky Acts and similar will doubtless deserve their comeuppance in many cases, what of their allies in the C-suite? Because while they're happy to visit punishment personally on a Russian oligarch or an African dictator or an Israeli billionaire, when it comes to the role in global corruption that Western executives play, we almost invariably punish not the individual, but the corporate entity through which they act. We allow ourselves to believe that ethereal corporations themselves are the transgressors. Never has a chief executive of a major oil mining company caught red-handed in bribery been prosecuted. Instead, the company pays an enormous fine, typically to the US Department of Justice, effectively transferring the cost of making amends to the shareholders, which are in turn largely just our pensions. The protection that the kingpins of the oil and mining industry, as long with the financiers behind them, derive from the legal fiction of the corporation is in stark contrast to Boris Sifer's defenselessness back in that Congolese village. I would agree with Mr. de Colombier that transparency alone is not enough. Beneficial ownership registries and these admirable disclosure regimes that have been developed are valuable. But what they must support and what we really vitally need is for the criminal law to be upheld. We need independent judiciaries served by well-funded, non-political, accountable law enforcement agencies. Years of cuts to public services in Europe have enfeebled many of these agencies. Populists are raging against the institutions of justice just when we need them most. It's surely the fight against corruption that will do as much as anything to counter inequality, whether in Luanda or London, Riyadh or Rio. Others here today will speak with much greater knowledge than me about the details of these policy questions. But I would just add, finally, a couple of thoughts from my experience. Some of these are much more closely linked to questions for member states, perhaps, but I think they deserve discussion today. At present, corporate secrecy allows oil and mining multinationals to retain a fig leaf of innocence when they cut deals that involve payoffs to anonymously held front companies. Take the case of Cobalt Energy in Angola, Cobalt International Energy. Cobalt was an oil company founded by Goldman Sachs and other Wall Street financiers It was headquartered in Houston. In 2008, Cobalt's bosses were negotiating with the government of Angola for the rights to drill for oil in a promising patch of Atlantic seabed. The Angolan government had a stipulation. Cobalt could have the rights it wanted, but it would have to take as its partner a previously unheard of local company whose owners were hidden behind a front company. Cobalt agreed. Corporate investigators in Luanda warned that the front company was secretly owned by some of the most powerful men in the land. In 2012, I wrote a story on the front page of the Financial Times confirming the identity of Cobalt's secret partners. They included the head of security in the repressive Angolan regime, and they included the head of the state oil company that was responsible for granting Cobalt its rights. But Cobalt continued to insist, even after these revelations, that it had done nothing wrong. Its investors and executives pocketed millions upon millions of dollars by selling shares after the Angolan venture had struck oil. No one has ever been brought to account in this case. This use of local partners, so-called local partners, often just shell companies, to divert revenues from the state treasury to private pockets is regrettably common in the oil and mining industries. What if the rules were different? What if we had what lawyers call strict liability? That's to say, what if the law said that if company A agrees to a deal that benefits company B without establishing the true owners of company B, and those owners were later found to have been corrupt officials, then company A would be treated as if it had knowingly engaged in corruption. At a stroke, the usefulness of front companies to the corrupt would be dramatically reduced. I'll just make one more final suggestion. Perhaps we have to go further still. You may have seen in the last few days the UK using successfully an unexplained wealth order for the first time. These demand that the object of the order demonstrate his or her wealth has a legitimate source. What if we ran with this principle? Perhaps we need to move beyond the impractical insistence that banks prove a negative, that their client's money is not dirty, to an obligation on the client to demonstrate that their money is clean. There are other areas that we could talk about in more depth if they come up later. I'll just make my very final thought. I think often we make the mistake of thinking that when we talk about natural resource corruption, that what's at stake is ill-gotten yachts and other unowned luxury. But what's really at stake, and this was alluded to earlier, is our ability to hold the powerful to account. That goes both for the impoverished millions who have the misfortune to live in countries where there's treasure under the ground, and for those of us in wealthier countries whose precious institutions are slowly being corroded by dirty money. And I'd argue the stakes could not be higher. Thanks very much.
Grazie davvero per le cose che ci ha detto, per il suo contributo. Adesso proseguiamo la nostra discussione con il primo panel, lo coordina il mio collega Pascal Durand, al quale cedo la parola.
Merci beaucoup Sergio. On va rester dans les langues latines, italien et français. Juste pour l'animation, on est un peu en retard, donc je pense que le débat, on le décalera pour faire le débat avec la deuxième table ronde, de manière à ce que nos orateurs puissent quand même s'exprimer. Donc on va tout de suite aborder la question de la mise en œuvre de la législation de 2013, sachant que on a tous bien compris que lorsqu'on écoute Monsieur du Colombier, on a l'impression que les choses avancent et qu'on est dans une réalité, une work in progress, et que finalement la législation n'est pas encore parfaite, mais bon, tout va bien. Et puis quand on entend Monsieur Burgess, on a plus envie de déprimer et de se dire que finalement, ça me fait penser un peu toujours à ces discours écolos. D'un côté, on dit bah oui, mais le climat c'est foutu parce qu'on n'y arrivera jamais. Puis en même temps, on a une économie qui bouge un peu et qui se transforme, et on se dit, ben si, quand même, on peut faire quelque chose. Donc j'espère que cette première table ronde va nous permettre de voir que cette législation, finalement, a quand même une utilité, et là où on peut la faire évoluer. Donc la première à prendre la parole sera Madame Louise Crawford, qui va s'exprimer en tant que spécialiste de la comptabilité et professeur à l'Université de Newcastle, je crois. Et donc, je vous donne tout de suite pour cette première expression.
Puoi mettere, sorry, can you put the record?
Thank you. I am going to present some research that myself and colleagues coordinated by the 4 universities you see there have undertaken, looking at how the EU legislation has been implemented across the European Union member states. Country by country reporting
Sorry.
Okay, country by country reporting then is now required to be undertaken by in-scope large listed companies across EU member states, requires that companies will publicly report on an annual basis country by country information and project by project information. The reason for this is to try and make these provisions overcome some of the concerns that surround the resource curse. So by increasing transparency of revenue payments, hopefully this will enable accountability of countries and companies, to enable civil society to hold these country governments to account with the intention of improving the socio-economic condition of civil society in these countries. Our approach to the research was we created a collective of accounting academics across Europe. We found when we started to look for reports and payments to governments, they were quite difficult to find. We created a collective that we called the STAR Collective, and we've managed to access reports and payments to governments across 19 member states in the European Union. We've collected 245 sets of accounts over 2 reporting periods, and we've also interviewed almost 30 stakeholders representing non-governmental organisations, regulators, legislators, preparers and investors. So we're trying to gather some information about how this legislation has been implemented and perceived. What we found is that this law is progress on the situation that we had before the law. So the reports are being used by civil society and they're being used for the intended purpose. We found evidence that the corporate world are not resisting the disclosures and are taking the disclosures seriously, and they're not reporting undue hardship from those disclosures. And the industry representatives that we've spoken to are also sympathetic with the underlying aims. We can see that there's some good reporting practices are emerging, so some corporate organisations are going beyond the minimum compliance and are actually reporting extended voluntary contextual information in addition to the minimum requirements. And we started to talk to the investor community, and what we're seeing there is that the investor community are not particularly aware at the moment of this reporting requirement, but they're becoming more aware. But there's a tendency for the investor community to look at it as well, will it add to our value model, whereas the investors that are interested in sustainable development are more interested in the reputational value that is created from this kind of disclosure. There are improvements to be made. So some of the issues that we found, for example, about a fifth to a quarter of companies didn't report the entity to which, the government entity to which the payment was being made. There are interpretation issues within the legislation. So for example, how different companies in different countries are interpreting the categories of payments to account show quite a diverse spread of information, and the detail you can get in the main report. There are different ways of interpreting substantially interconnected, which has a material impact on the way companies are aggregating projects for disclosure. And there's a lack of reporting requirement and guidance on joint operations, so companies can be conservatively or otherwise using this lack of legislation to report or not report clearly the payments to governments. Another problem with usability of the accounts is that in addition to accessibility issues that I'll go on to, the format that the accounts, the reports and payments to governments are being produced are quite variable. So you get a very simple spreadsheet type format with little contextual information but it's maybe machine readable, or you can get PDF only, which is human readable but not machine readable. or some companies are producing both, so you'll be able to do both and you can see some contextual information, but it's difficult to look at the reports and compare them across different companies that are reporting. In addition, the reports are mainly not subject to any kind of voluntary validation through limited assurance or through reconciliation to audited financial statements, and that makes it difficult to kind of have a sense of trust or a feel for where these numbers are coming from and how they align to other corporate disclosures. In terms of accessibility, it's difficult to find these reports. You need to know that the company is reporting, and then you need to know where to go to find the reports. And this is more problematic in some member states than it is in others. There isn't any maintained list anywhere of those companies that should be reporting, so it's difficult to know. You have to start finding out, should the company report, and if they're reporting, where might they report. And we've also found evidence that the state's obligation to monitor compliance has mainly not been met. So although the reports are being submitted to a business or a company's register or available on a website, there's no monitoring of the compliance or whether in-scope companies are actually reporting as they should do. In conclusion, though, we find that this is progress. The law is progress dependent compared to the situation before. We have more companies that are reporting more information. The information is current and it's timely compared to some of the other initiatives like the EITI, which we spoke about earlier. The fact that the reports are being used by civil society is a strong indication of the value that they're adding, and the fact that it can be used to extend and advance accountability in resource-rich countries. We do have recommendations about improving the law. The first one is, in order for these reports to be useful, they have to be accessible. So we would recommend that there is better filing, preferably a central repository at the EU level. We'd recommend that there is a creation, publication and updating of a list of in-scope companies. We've actually found evidence of companies not particularly sure of whether they should be in scope and are having to consult with their own industrial body to find out whether they should report or not. So if there's a list of in-scope companies, that would be incredibly helpful. In terms of enhancing usability, trust and confidence, we would recommend that some kind of validation is implemented. That could be a full audit, limited assurance audit, or reconciliation to audited financial statements, so that you can pin these numbers to something that you trust or trust more. There should be more effective government monitoring of compliance. Clarification is needed in terms of the terms substantially interconnected, how payments to accounts, types of payments are interpreted and categorised, and also some kind of guidance or clarification or improvement in terms of accounting for payments in respect of joint arrangements. There should also be some contextual information to understand the basis of how these numbers have been prepared. And finally, there should be some kind of report consistency, so that if you find a report on payments to government, you can read it and you can subject it to analysis through machine readability. And it would also be helpful if there is some kind of alignment with the other reporting requirements out there by the EITI and OECD. The last slide. The full report and the detail of the findings of the analysis of these 245 sets of reports and payments to government can be found at the link. There are summaries that are available at the desk up there. You'll find the link there, and you can go into the detail, and we can be contacted as required. So thank you, and I'll pass on to Elena.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here this morning. I work for Transparency International EU, and I will today present a new report that we just launched this morning called Under the Surface. You will find copies available here in the room, as well as a short summary document. In this report, we have looked at project level data from payments to governments by several oil, gas, and mining companies in 4 different countries of operation. And thanks to the findings of our analysis, I will outline some of the main achievements and shortcomings of the existing EU legislation, as well as present some of the trends that may be identified by analysing So at this crucial moment of the first ongoing EU legislative review, we've decided to look at the evidence that exists regarding the implementation of the legislation that was adopted 5 years ago. And this report is really supposed to be something to help the European Commission to make an informed review of current companies' practices. So as I said, this report assesses project-level data from the Payments to Governance report of 3 different companies and a joint venture. So you have the 4 case studies here on the slide, so Tallow Oil in Equatorial Guinea, Repsol in Bolivia, Vedanta in India, and then a joint venture in Angola between Statoil, BP, Eni, and ExxonMobil as an operator. Just a brief side note on Statoil. Statoil has changed its name to Equinor this year, but because the payments and activities that we refer to in the report are prior to this name change, we still kept the original name of Statoil. We've used certain criteria to select these projects. You will also find published together with the report a methodology annex where you can see the exact details of the methodology that we've used for all these 4 case studies. Next slide, please. So on the key findings, our analysis shows that the legislation has definitely ensured more public availability of information on payments made by extractive companies, which has significantly improved transparency and accountability in a traditionally opaque sector. Because previously these payments were made largely in secret, which made it obviously impossible for citizens to scrutinize them and hold their governments to account. What we've also highlighted in our research is that the value of the EU's directive in bringing transparency in traditionally opaque countries like Angola or Equatorial Guinea, which are not part of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And also the value of the EU's legislation in shedding a light on companies that are neither headquartered nor listed in the EU, such as, for instance, the case of ExxonMobil, which is headquartered in a jurisdiction that is not subject to mandatory disclosure rules, but has subsidiaries in Germany and in Luxembourg, which have to comply with the requirements of the directive. However, we've also seen that there are a number of significant weaknesses in both the legislation itself, the way it was drafted, and the practice of implementing companies. And from our perspective, these weaknesses are a substantial limitation to the overall objective of the rules, which is to enhance public understanding of extractive companies' payments and activities. And this is particularly evident in our report in several areas. For instance, in the different approaches that companies choose to adopt when reporting on their joint venture payments, on the way they report on their royalty payments and in-kind payments, as well as some challenges related to the analysis of corporate income tax payments vis-a-vis other types of tax payments. And I'm glad to hear that some of these challenges are also part of the first findings of the Commission's review. So in the findings of our report, you would see that we have grouped them into legislative gaps and implementation gaps. So legislative gaps are those areas where we think that the Accounting Directive lacks clarity in some of the definitions, the guidance to companies, and some of the legal requirements. Whereas the implementation gaps are those areas where we see some discrepancies and inconsistencies in the way companies report. So I'm conscious that we're a bit late, so I'm not going to go through the details of all of them, but perhaps just one example that I think is important is the first one mentioned among the legislative gaps, which is that the Accounting Directive doesn't clarify how companies should report on their joint venture payments. And this lack of guidance has led to limited data when companies report on their joint venture payments. So we've included one case study on a joint venture, as I said, in Angola between Statoil, ExxonMobil, BP, and Eni. And in this case, we were able to analyze this project because Statoil has provided additional data compared to its joint venture partners. But for instance, in this case, we saw that BP and Eni chose to omit their payments for this project in their reports, as they are not the operators in this joint venture. But despite, well, BP holding a 26% of stake in the project and Eni holding a 20% of stake in the project. So the accounting directive is not really clear on how companies should go about the reporting in these cases. However, we think that as an industry that relies heavily on joint venture agreements, this represents a substantial gap in the way companies are reporting on their payments and is clearly in contravention of the spirit of the law. So what we recommend in this case is that companies should report on their joint venture payments on a proportionate basis, regardless of whether they are the operator or not in that project. We have in this report made several detailed recommendations to the Commission, mainly in these 5 areas that we have on the slide. So on how companies should explain their interpretation of payment categories, which sometimes makes it challenging for users of the reports to understand what has been included under a category and under another one. How companies report on their payments in kind, how they identify the recipients of payments, so the exact government entity that receives the payment from the company. How they report, as I said, on joint venture payments, and how they report on their corporate income tax payments. I'm not going to go into the details of the recommendations because they will be then mentioned by my colleague James Larson from PWYP in the next panel. But what I just wanted to say to conclude is that we think that this first ongoing legislative review is an excellent opportunity for the Commission to propose some minor selective adjustments to the details of the legislation to ensure that it is more effective and really delivers on its intended objectives. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Elena, pour avoir en plus accéléré la présentation. C'est jamais facile, surtout sur des sujets comme ça, de réduire les détails. On va maintenant prendre l'exemple du Niger, et donc avec Ali Idrissa, que l'on ne présente pas, et on va dire en 2 mots, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de casquettes au Niger. Il y a beaucoup de difficultés, à la fois sur la question des droits humains et évidemment sur l'extraction minière. Et la France fait sa part, et on prend largement sa part. Donc voilà, parlons du Niger.
Merci à vous et d'avoir quand même permis de pouvoir vous exprimer aujourd'hui devant vous. Parlant du Niger, je n'ai pas beaucoup à présenter du Niger. C'est quand même un pays de 1 267 km², d'1 million d'habitants, riche en or, en pétrole, en uranium, mais dernier en matière d'industrie de développement humain. Donc, quand on parle de malédiction des ressources, on n'ira pas loin pour chercher. Et le Niger n'échappe pas à la règle générale. Les ressources naturelles, à un moment, représentent 70% de nos exportations au niveau national. Donc, l'agriculture et les autres secteurs, c'est 30%. Mais les ressources ne rapportaient pas 5% au PIB de notre pays. Moins de 15% au budget de l'État. C'est sûr que ce paradoxe peut amener à réfléchir et à comprendre quand même que, effectivement, le pays ne tire pas beaucoup de ressources et même les ressources qui tombent sont mal gérées et détournées au profit d'une classe politique ou bien de l'élite qui est là, qui gouverne actuellement. Les données publiées par les entreprises européennes nous ont permis, à coup sûr, de pouvoir mettre le doigt sur certains problèmes même de nos propres contrats, sur certains problèmes de pouvoir des recettes qui proviennent de ces ressources. Vous vous rappelez bien, en 2013, il y avait ce mouvement que la société civile nigérienne avait engagé pour pour qu'il y ait une transparence autour du renouvellement des contrats Areva-Niger. C'était engagé, on s'était perdu, d'autres ont séjourné encore entre la police judiciaire et les prisons à cause de cela. Mais au finish, on avait quand même signé un contrat que le gouvernement nigérien qualifiait de gagnant-gagnant entre Areva et le Niger. C'était suite à ça et avec cette opportunité de la directive de l'Union européenne, nous avions engagé une étude avec Oxfam qui nous a permis de voir que le Niger s'était retrouvé à gagner moins d'avant le renouvellement des contrats. Donc, dire que ça n'a pas servi à nos sociétés ou bien à nos organisations, c'est quand même ne pas pouvoir dire la réalité des choses, parce que le gouvernement présentait ce contrat comme étant le contrat qu'on n'a jamais eu depuis près de 40 ans, qu'Areva était en train d'exploiter les ressources dans notre pays. Et aussi, si vous prenez cette fameuse affaire de Uranium Gate qu'il y a eu au Niger, une transaction de 200 milliards de francs CFA qu'il y a eu entre Areva et le Niger, une société nigérienne, Sofamine, pilotée par un ministre à la présidence au Niger. Et ça a eu lieu en 2011, mais on n'a pu le savoir qu'en 2016. S'il y avait la directive de l'Union européenne à ce moment en 2011, on aurait su cela très tôt et pouvoir rattraper les choses. Mais c'était carrément après tout ce temps. Ces montants n'ont jamais fait preuve de transactions dans le budget de l'État nigérien. Et le Niger a été utilisé pour budget et la France et le Niger. Parce qu'on a utilisé quand même de l'argent public français pour le sortir des caisses et il n'y a jamais eu d'uranium qui a été livré, il n'y a jamais eu de produit qui a été livré. Et cette affaire s'appelle Uranium Gate. Et nous, en tant que société civile, on a porté plainte devant les juridictions nigériennes, mais le dossier n'a pas bougé. Le juge s'est permis de nous demander 20 millions de francs CFA de caution, sachant que nous, en tant que société civile, on n'a pas ces ressources pour pouvoir le faire débloquer et le dossier reste bloqué. Alors qu'une affaire similaire a eu lieu et la société civile gabonaise a porté plainte devant la justice française, ils n'ont payé que 600 € comme frais de caution. Vous voyez bien que si comme de telles initiatives existent, c'est vrai, le Niger est un pays membre aussi, cette opportunité, le Niger s'est retrouvé à un moment même de rupture avec l'Éthiopie. Mais du fait toujours de cette obligation de la directive de l'Union européenne, Areva et les compagnies qui sont obligées continuent à publier, à montrer quand même, à faire en sorte que nous, sociétés civiles nigériennes, on puisse pouvoir voir les chiffres qui doivent être versés au Niger, même si nous n'avions pas la maîtrise de la gestion de ces revenus. Au Niger, il y a une loi qui consacre 15% aux hommes d'exploitation, c'est-à-dire aux communautés qui sont directement touchées par l'exploitation de ces ressources. Si nous n'avions pas les chiffres provenant des publications de la directive de l'Union européenne, nous n'aurions jamais pu interpeller l'État du Niger sur ses obligations, même vis-à-vis de ces communautés. Donc, dire que, bon, c'est sûr que pour nous, ces lois, il y a des lois au Niger, il y a la constitution qui oblige l'État du Niger à publier les revenus tirés de l'exploitation des ressources, et même plus loin, dans leur utilisation même, qu'ils sont obligés d'utiliser dans les secteurs prioritaires, c'est-à-dire l'éducation, la santé et autres, que par le passé, on voyait les gouvernements nigériens se permettaient de prendre l'argent du pétrole et de l'uranium pour acheter des armes. Tout le monde sait c'est quoi le marché des armes. C'est le marché de gré à gré, d'entente directe, qui sont passés, qui ne passent même pas, il n'y a pas d'appel d'offres public. Tout le monde sait, donc c'est sûr que... Mais toutes ces obligations, sans les directives au niveau international, nous ne pourrions pas arriver à pouvoir faire concrétiser, amener nos propres dirigeants à pouvoir aller dans ce sens. Le président du Parlement était récemment chez nous, l'Européen était chez nous, où il parlait de gouvernance et de migration. C'est sûr qu'on on n'a pas à se cacher la face. Si tant est que dans nos pays, on continue à vivre la misère et que pour ces jeunes, l'Europe c'est l'espoir, vous allez toujours faire face à la migration. Donc il faut quand même pouvoir faire en sorte que ces pays soient viables, et que tous puissent avoir les mêmes chances de pouvoir vivre dans ces pays. L'Union européenne a beau envoyer de l'argent et de l'aide dans ces pays, tant que c'est mal géré, je vous jure que la migration continuera et les lots de migrants que vous allez recevoir sur les bateaux ne pourront qu'augmenter. C'est entre celui qui prétend avoir de l'espoir en venant à l'Europe et celui qui prétend pouvoir, s'il reste sur place, mourir. C'est de ça qu'il s'agit. Je préfère avoir l'espoir de pouvoir conquérir les côtes européennes que de rester chez moi. Voilà, pour nous, il est essentiel de comprendre que ça, c'est une chaîne. Mettre l'accent sur la gouvernance dans nos pays, mettre l'accent sur, qui permettra, tout à l'heure j'ai entendu le premier intervenant, notamment monsieur le directeur des investissements du Colombien, qui parlait, est-ce que nos pays ont aussi cette capacité de responsabiliser nos dirigeants? Oui, nous acceptons même aller en prison pour cela. Nous ne sommes pas allés en prison pour avoir volé. Nous partons en prison pour juste demander à ce qu'il y ait une gouvernance permettant à chaque citoyen de pouvoir se développer. Donc pour nous, nous sommes prêts à ce sacrifice, mais il faut bien que les partenaires puissent pouvoir accompagner dans ce sens. Permettre l'ouverture de l'espace civique dans nos pays. Faire de ça des obligations dans le cadre de la coopération. Aucun de ces pays ne peut se permettre de l'absence de cette coopération. Mais donc, pour nous, il est clair que les dirigeants européens, nous, pendant notre arrestation, ici je fais l'aveu, si ce n'est pas le ton qu'avaient fait monter les parlementaires américains, nous continuerons à garder prison aujourd'hui. Au niveau de certains pays membres de l'Union européenne, on nous taxait même de prisonniers du droit commun. Donc, parce qu'aujourd'hui, c'est vrai, l'État du Niger a ouvert ses frontières pour les bases militaires et à pouvoir se faire comme gardien de frontières pour empêcher la migration est devenu le bon élève le plus fréquentable. Mais c'était ça qui a permis. Donc, nous sommes prêts au sacrifice, aidez-nous à aller devant. C'est sûr que pour la directive de l'Union européenne, nous avions aussi des recommandations. Il faut bien qu'on aille jusqu'au volume peut-être, de pouvoir savoir combien de fonds ont été extraits dans nos sous-sols, pour pouvoir que nous puissions voir selon les marchés, les taux des marchés, combien on aurait pu gagner. Et aussi les transactions. Il n'y a rien à cacher. Au fait, les contrats même et autres sont cachés seulement aux citoyens et au peuple. Tout le monde sait que ces compagnies, pour pouvoir avoir accès à des crédits, sont obligées de s'ouvrir aux banques et aux investisseurs dans le sens de pouvoir prendre des crédits. Donc, pour nous, cette coopération, et nous avions fait cette étude, j'aurais bien aimé que Quentin, qui a fait l'étude avec nous, donne des détails. Je pense que dans les discussions, il doit avoir le temps de donner dans les détails et des chiffres pour qu'on puisse comprendre que cette directive a été extrêmement importante pour nous permettre de relever les grandes contradictions que le gouvernement nigérien chantait. Je vous remercie.
Merci infiniment, Lisa, pour cet éclairage et les combats qui doivent être menés et cette démonstration qui évidemment, pour Sergio et moi, reste une évidence, mais qui ne l'est pas pour tout le monde, de savoir que la corruption, le détournement des ressources de la nature et les droits humains et l'exploitation humaine sont indissociablement liés et qu'on ne peut pas résoudre les uns sans parler des autres, et que évidemment quand on parle de compétitivité, quand on parle de fitness et de législation, derrière il y a la misère, il y a l'exploitation et il y a des souffrances. Donc merci de l'avoir rappelé. Alors là je me tourne vers Sergio pour juste sur un plan pratique. Normalement, nous avions un débat, là on est bon sur les horaires pour la deuxième table ronde. Est-ce qu'on fait quand même le débat sur la première ou est-ce qu'on garde le débat pour la fin? Je te laisse arbitrer avec ta sagesse habituelle. Décide.
Io credo che sia meglio fare il dibattito alla fine, così diamo la possibilità ai nostri ospiti di parlare. Chiedo la cortesia ai nostri ospiti di rispettare il tempo che gli avevamo indicato. So che è poco, ma è abitudine del Parlamento europeo avere tempi contingentati, soprattutto per noi latini che parliamo molto, e il primo impatto col Parlamento è drammatico, perché per un italiano parlare 2 minuti è un dramma, però ci si abitua. Dunque darei la parola al dottor Lichtenberg, che è il capo dell'Ufficio Affari Europei di Equinor. Chiedo agli interlocutori adesso di guardare anche al futuro e di ragionare insieme a noi su che cosa conviene fare per rafforzare gli strumenti che abbiamo utilizzato per affrontare una situazione drammatica come quella che è stata descritta. Dunque, Yannick Lichtenberg, prego la parola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and dear distinguished members of the European Parliament, Transparency International, and all other friends of transparency. Thank you for inviting Equinor, previously Statoil, to this interesting session. Equinor is a listed company in the area of energy, with activities in more than 30 countries. Our purpose is to turn natural resources into energy for people and progress for society. And we believe that openness and transparency support and strengthen our vision of shaping the future of energy. Transparency is a cornerstone of good governance and supports our license to operate. I'm proud to state that Equinor is recognized as a leading company within the field of transparency. In our first annual sustainability report in 2001, the year that we was listed as a company, we underlined the importance of supporting transparency whilst recognizing the dilemma of low transparency in many oil-rich countries. The year after, information on signature bonuses was given, and we started cooperating with Transparency International. We also welcome the movement of creating an international transparency initiative, the EITI, a three-party initiative between governments, civil society, and companies. The EITI has evolved into a very successful initiative, with over 50 resource-rich countries implementing its standards with the goal to promote open and accountable management of oil, gas, and minerals. Several other initiatives underline the relevance of today's topic. Transparency plays a critical part of SDG 16, which is about building strong institutions, whilst SDG 17 is about partnerships and underlines how government, business, and civil society must work together to meet all the strategic development goals. From 2004, Equinor started voluntarily disclosing a country-by-country overview of taxes paid, and from 2014 we reported under the Norwegian version of the EU Accounting Directive. Norway was the first EEA country to require reporting, and the Norwegian rule went beyond the EU directive. But it was not very detailed and had to be interpreted to make sure it was useful and user-friendly. With experience, our reporting has evolved, both in format and content, and from being a separate publication in 2014 and 15, the report is now part of our annual reporting package. This helps putting the country-by-country report in a broader context. Please note that these improvements were made without rule changing. Although Equinor in many instances has gone beyond the requirements on country-by-country reporting, we have not identified any negative effects from our approach, rather to the contrary. Openness leads to trust, which is increasingly important to succeed. We welcome transparency reporting that is useful and user-friendly, and support the idea launched by a coalition of NGOs for a common register of the reports. It is too early to give a full evaluation of the Accounting Directive, but we hope that other jurisdictions will look to harmonize rules when they follow suit. Furthermore, we must never lose sight of the purpose of the directive and make sure that its scope is kept with that in mind. This year, new rules were introduced in Norway with the purpose of combating unwanted tax planning, leading to avoidance. It was directly inspired by the EU Commission's proposals from April 2016. In Norway, it is only applicable for extractive industries. Companies need to contribute a fair share of to the societies in which they operate, or they might be seen as challenging democratically developed welfare state and tax systems. As a responsible corporate citizen, Equinor supports tax transparency. We have published our global tax strategy on our corporate webpage and sent a strong message that we will pay our taxes where legally due and where the economic value is generated. We are organizing our taxpayers to follow economic and commercial substance, and artificial transactions with no connections to our business activities will not be pursued. The tax strategy is approved, owned and overseen at board level, and top management support has been a key enabler for all our transparency work. Looking beyond Equinor and Norway, both the ITI and the Accounting Directive are operational and successful, and the international transparency agenda is evolving. Hopefully, our industry can serve as an inspiration for fair and correct tax rules, enabling businesses both in the extractive sector and beyond to contribute to society and create level playing fields. Thank you.
Siamo noi che ringraziamo lei per la bella esplicitazione di un comportamento estremamente positivo che speriamo venga imitato anche da altri. Noi ci siamo battuti a lungo dentro questo Parlamento per la rendicontazione paese per paese, considerandolo uno strumento indispensabile nelle politiche fiscali dell'Unione Europea. Lei ci ha appena confermato che si può fare con vantaggi anche per le imprese. Dunque, grazie. Adesso do la parola a James Royston, che è il coordinatore regionale per i paesi del G20 nel segretariato internazionale dell'organizzazione pubblica Quello che Paghi. È un'organizzazione che raggruppa più di 700 ONG, ha una dimensione di grandissimo rilievo. 700 ONG in 60 paesi diversi. James ha lavorato già in precedenza molto dentro questo palazzo, si trova un po' a casa sua. Grazie per essere qui anche questa mattina e ti cedo la parola.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cofferati, and thanks for making this event possible. I too would like to pay tribute to our colleagues in the room who've recently been imprisoned for standing up for transparency and trying themselves to address the resource curse, if not fully beat it. As explained, I represent Publish What You Pay, a global coalition of more than 700 NGOs in over 60 countries, working together for an open and accountable extractive sector to ensure that where oil, gas and mining operations take place, citizens benefit and have some say over how and indeed whether they are extracted. We've campaigned since our establishment in 2002 for the creation of a global standard for payments to governments reporting, known as a mandatory disclosure standard. We believe that requiring companies to publish what they pay to governments increases public understanding, it acts as a deterrent for corruption, it provides relevant and important up-to-date information for investors, it can prevent conflict, and as our colleague from Equinor just echoed, it can improve a business and government's reputation and their social license to operate. We also believe, though these rules have not been in place for that long, that we're beginning to see evidence of this, and I think several of our colleagues in the room have explained how that's the case. The past few years have seen great strides towards establishing a global mandatory disclosure standard, with the adoption of the EU's Accounting and Transparency Directive as a central and world-leading part of that. Thanks to the Accounting and Transparency Directives, Canada followed suit with its own Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act, or ESTMA. Norway adopted its own stricter version of the Accounting Directive, and Switzerland, Ukraine, and still the United States are all in the process of adopting their own mandatory disclosure rules. The major opposition party in Australia has committed to bringing in a mandatory disclosure law if they're elected in the upcoming election. So we believe it's clear that there is a trend towards greater transparency, and that we have the EU to thank in part for that. However, there are ways in which these laws can be improved, and it's on that I'm here to talk to you today, and we welcome the European Commission's review and the opportunity to do that. Our advocacy paper, which is here and I think available on the tables over there, improving transparency in the oil, gas and mining sectors, the EU's payments to government legislation, goes into a lot more detail than I intend to today. And we've categorised our recommendations into three key areas. First is accessing data, second is clarifying existing data, and the third is increasing that data and guaranteeing its quality. So our key recommendations regarding access to data, as several colleagues here have already suggested, we feel that companies should be required to publish directly to a central online repository that is hosted and maintained by the European Commission, and is freely accessible to the public. At the moment, many reports are very difficult to find. They're in single languages. Some of them are hard for humans to read, some of them are hard for machines to read, and we don't think it would be too difficult to make them available. I would, for those who are interested in having a look at what's been disclosed so far, I would recommend NRGI, the Natural Resource Governance Institute's resourceprojects.org website, which attempts to collate these, but we do not believe it should be civil society's responsibility to put this data into a publicly accessible format. I won't go into detail, but we think it's relevant for ESMA to develop and operate the European Electronic Access Point to provide access to companies' information, as is already required, and EU member states should be required to set up officially appointed mechanisms as per their existing obligations. In terms of clarifying existing data, we've heard in Professor Crawford's presentation of the need for clearer definitions, particularly around what constitutes substantially interconnected agreements, legal agreements, to avoid the artificial aggregation of projects, which we've seen in a number of parts of the world. For example, BHP Billiton claims that Western Australia is one single project, but it's an area that's bigger than any EU member state and has many separate projects that are hundreds of miles or kilometres away from one another. We believe that all joint venture payments larger than €100,000 should be disclosed, whether they're made directly by the company, indirectly by the operator, or by another entity on the reporting company's behalf, on a proportionate basis. At the moment, we have a wide variety of interpretations of the obligations for joint venture reporting, and we do not get a clear picture. And some of the biggest mines in the world are joint ventures, and we do not have data for them. In-kind payments need to be reported both in value and, where applicable, in volume, and we would like to see an explanation of how the value has been determined. In-kind payments shouldn't be aggregated with cash payments in a single figure, or they become far less meaningful. Though I think one of the previous speakers claimed that this is always done, it's not done. Companies are not required at the moment to state the name of the national or subnational government entity or other government body receiving each of their payments. Often it will simply say government of country X, and it will leave it to that. It won't say which agency or which department, which limits our opportunities to hold companies or governments to account. Exchange rates should be disclosed, and companies should be required to explain their interpretation of payment categories consistent with the existing Articles 41 and 43.4. And finally, we would like to see increased data and increased data quality, which we believe can complement this legislation and improve it, and we don't believe that it will stop it from being equivalent from other mandatory disclosure standards elsewhere in the world. We'd like to see additional categories of payments to governments on which companies have to report, particularly payments related to the sale of oil, gas and minerals, commodities trading, which in many countries accounts for far more of the government revenue than extraction itself. We'd like to see disclosure of payments for transportation and export activities, social expenditures, and to state security forces for security services, all areas which are prone to corruption. Finally, one thing that we heard from the academics in particular was about how difficult it was to find out if companies had indeed complied, because there was no list of companies that fall into scope, but also companies are not required to list projects that are not listed because payments during the reporting period were less than €100,000. We believe both should be listed. I won't go into a huge amount of detail because I believe it's been covered already, but we'd like to see further contextual data per project. We would like to see limited assurance at least, if not full audit, and we commend Equinor on aligning their payments to government reports to the annual report. We think that's a really important way to make a greater sense of data. And we would like to see companies disclose additional country-by-country tax-related data based on the information that we've seen in the report last year. And finally, but perhaps this is an element that the Deckers can address in a moment, or that we can discuss in the debate. We'd be keen to understand more about the interrelatedness between this review and the fitness check consultation that's ongoing. We see the fitness check as an opportunity to establish a centralised repository, which is important to achieving the objectives of this, but will have a far wider benefit for company reporting in the EU. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Grazie James. Do la parola a Len De Kerr, il capo dell'unità accounting e di contazione finanziaria della DG FISMA. Ha una lunghissima e riconosciuta esperienza in materia e devo dire, le sue parole potranno aiutarci già rispondendo ad alcune delle sollecitazioni che sono venute, ma per aiutarci anche a immaginare con ancora più precisione quali possono essere gli sviluppi futuri della legislazione. Prego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I grew up in the south of Spain, so I'm also partly Dutch, but I will try to keep it as short as possible in the interest of time. I'd like to begin by thanking very much all the organizations who have presented their reports today. Some of this information in general is very useful to us, and will of course fully take into account in the work that we're doing. As an overall point, it's very positive from our side to hear that this information is, even if it's maybe imperfect, it is nevertheless useful. And this is also something we have seen in a parallel piece of legislation, which is country-by-country reporting for the banking sector, where Transparency International also some time ago published a report using the data being made available because of that legislation. So these are all positive developments. Of course, we recognize that there are issues that need to be looked at. It's very rare for legislation to be perfect from the first iteration, despite the best efforts of the Commission to propose a coherent text, and also the Parliament and Council to adopt a good legislation, but none of us ever get it entirely right. And that leads me to briefly run through what we are doing now to try to address, first of all, analyze these issues, and then how we intend to take them forward. First of all, I'd like to start with the big picture, and this is also a point that was just raised by Mr. Royston concerning the fitness check. As I listened to the presentations, I heard a number of points which were raised, which indeed are points that are mentioned in the review article in Chapter 10 of the directive, but which arise not only in this context, but also in other pieces of legislation. Two examples of those would be the accessibility of information, and another example would be requirements on assurance or audit of information that are published in company reports. These are, as I say, issues that are not specific to this piece of legislation. They arise in a number of areas covered by our legislation in the field of corporate reporting, and that is why we felt, after a period when there had been quite a few new requirements that had been introduced, which were innovative, which were not the traditional kind of financial reporting that we introduced in the EU about 40 years ago, there was a need to look at this legislation in the whole and see if we can draw any cross-cutting conclusions also in areas such as these. That is why we decided to launch a fitness check that we're now carrying out. As you know, we've had a public consultation in the first half of this year, and we intend to publish the conclusions of that fitness check towards the middle of next year. Another reason why we felt it was necessary to look at our legislation in the whole, partly for practical reasons, is that we had embedded in the various pieces of legislation in the field of corporate reporting review reports on ad hoc elements of that legislation. And this would have led us to, if we had taken those literally, it would have led us to publish these ad hoc reports, which may have been interesting for the specific issues that they covered, but we thought it was more interesting to have a look at the legislation in a more comprehensive manner. So that is the reason why those are the reasons why we launched the fitness check, and as I said, we'll publish the conclusions of that in the middle of next year. Now, a fitness check, just to be clear, is an analysis of how the legislation is working, whether it is still fit for purpose, whether it is proportionate, whether it is effective, whether it adds value, etc., etc. So there are a number of criteria that we have to run through. The results of the fitness check will not necessarily immediately lead to legislative proposals, and certainly I would be very surprised if any legislative proposals emerge under the current Commission's mandate. So legislative proposals would be a second step that we would undertake, likely under the mandate of the next Commission, and that of course is subject to political decisions by that the new Commission. In addition to that, there are a number of issues specific to the legislation on CBCR for extractive and forestry industries, and we are addressing those issues through our own study. Some of you may have been contacted in the context of that study. We hope to have the results of that study towards the beginning of next year. It is well advanced, and listening to the presentations, I think it's fair to say that the issues that we are looking at in the context of that study largely cut across, also overlap with the issues that have been raised by the presentations today. So that is encouraging that we both identified broadly a common set of issues. That, as I said, would be the results which should be available towards the beginning of the year. Now, in terms of the requirements of the article on the review directive, or Chapter 10, there are also a couple of points related to, for example, country-by-country publication of tax information, and also in relation to conflict minerals, for which, of course, there have been developments in the meantime. For conflict minerals, there's been a regulation adopted by the EU, and for country-by-country tax information, tax transparency, the Commission put forward a proposal. Parliament has done its homework on that and has now already adopted a negotiating mandate for that piece of legislation. Unfortunately, in the Council, things are less advanced and we're a little bit stuck there. But given those developments, I think those 2 points are something that we would hive off from the ongoing review of the legislation. Those are in broad terms the points I wanted to make in terms of the next steps. I think one point which came out very clearly from the presentations is the question of accessibility, and I just want to say a few more words about that, because as I say, this is a cross-cutting issue. There are a range of pieces of legislation in the EU legal order that require disclosure by corporates. Many of those are covered by the Transparency Directive, but even in the context of the Transparency Directive, that doesn't really provide a single point of access, because there is, first of all, the European Electronic Access Point, which has been mentioned, has not actually been implemented yet at this stage. Even if it were implemented as foreseen in the Transparency Directive, it would be reasonably limited in terms of the search capacities that it would provide. So we are currently, thanks to funding provided by the European Parliament and sponsored by Jakob von Weizsäcker from the S&D Group, we are currently carrying out a pilot project which we have grandly named the European Financial Transparency Gateway. We're trying to explore the use of blockchain technology to federate various sources of information from or repositories in which corporates store information. This is not about building a big database which would hold all the information, because that, I think, is something we'd like to avoid. Practical reasons, because one big database means one big IT project, which if it fails gets us into trouble, but also because it provides a single point of failure if anything ever goes wrong. So we are looking at providing a sort of an interoperability layer on top of existing repositories through which information can be accessed, so that to the user it looks like a single interface, even if physically the databases underneath that are distributed. So that is a pilot project, as I said. We are currently launching the second phase of that pilot project. And certainly in this area, this would be a way of linking also the information on payments for extractive industries to other aspects, to other corporate information that is provided and other corporate reports that are provided by those companies. So I can't promise you that this is something that will be implemented in the very short term, because as I say, last year we did a proof of concept, now we're moving to pilot project phase, and it will take some time to implement it, and of course this would require likely some legislative changes. But I'm very hopeful personally that this project will be an important contributor to a greater transparency and greater accessibility of information. There are a number for the basic information, but of course what we need to do also is ensure that the detailed information is freely accessible. Another point which has been raised is the question of format of the information and in which that is disclosed, whether it's machine readable or is it in PDF, is it in Excel, or all these things. You may be aware that for financial reports we are currently introducing a structured data standard. It's called the European Single Electronic Format. It is currently limited to consolidated reports based on IFRS for listed companies. But this kind of approach is potentially something which could be generalized for other types of disclosures. It would require use the development of appropriate taxonomies to ensure that the information is properly structured. But certainly digitization of information, I think, is something that is likely to remain on the agenda and in the next few years. And this is certainly one area in which this potential development could be explored. That again would allow more user-friendly access to this information and the better exploitation of this information. So those are some of the points I'd like to make. I realize that some of this is a little bit technical, but again, the point I want to emphasize is I think there is a lot of commonality in what we've heard today and the issues that we're currently looking at in this area, and we'll be looking very carefully certainly at the work that's been presented today. So thank you very much.
Grazie. Abbiamo 15 minuti per il dibattito prima di dare la parola a Pascal per le conclusioni. Chi di voi vuole intervenire lo segnali, se volete fare semplicemente delle domande fatele, in ogni caso presentatevi, dite chi siete e poi se farete delle domande daremo subito alla persona alle quali rivolgete il vostro quesito la possibilità di rispondere. Prima però vi chiederei di poter far parlare, se vuole, la collega Anna Gomes, che è stata qui fin dall'inizio e che ha sempre seguito queste materie con grande passione insieme a noi. Comunque, se vuole parlare, Anna.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you for organizing this debate. You and Pascal Durand and of course TI and other co-hosts, and thank you for the speakers. It's really important for us to understand how this is indeed enabling people to indeed account for what they pay and for what they earn and for what our citizens, as much as the citizens of the countries where the organized sector of natural resources is going on, don't earn. So I think that the links with taxation are really crucial here, and definitely I really hope that more people, namely from the Commission, would let us know on how indeed they see the consequences of what is now being nevertheless published, thanks to the Transparency Initiative, how that will have consequences as well at the level of the scrutiny in our countries, in the EU, for tax purposes. I thought I'm going to read the report with interest, of course, because the report provides very important information on concrete countries that have been following, namely Angola, Guinea Equatorial. But of course, it's not just only about these countries. I feel particularly responsible for these countries because they are linked to my own country, Portugal, through this Portuguese-speaking community, where we obviously have a particular responsibility. I feel that. But other countries are extremely important, and I was quite struck by the intervention of Mr. Drissa, actually also exposing our own shortcomings, even here in the European Parliament. We like to style ourselves as champions for human rights, but indeed, often we neglect people in countries which have a particular link, human and historical link with the European Union, as it's the case of Niger, because it doesn't fit the interests of some member states, which is actually were really complicit in the organized set. So I was really stuck that you told us that your own release was much more due to the pressure of US Congress members than members of this Parliament. I'm really sorry that this was the case. And that's one more reason why I think Also, we need to interact much more with the people bravely, like yourself, are in the countries where this organized crime, theft is going on, to indeed be much more effective, not just in supporting you in your fight for for fundamental rights, for human rights, but also for including economic rights, so that the resources will not be a curse, but will indeed generate profit for the people. But it's also about us, because indeed we cannot not just continue to neglect the way European companies behave. I noted, for instance, in Angola, what was said, that how BP and Eni managed to pretend that they fulfilled the directive, but in fact to not publish what they indeed pay and earn in the exploration, for instance, in Angola. And therefore, the question of indeed our own taxpayers, because obviously the connection with the organized tax evasion is there. And we have been, through our work, namely in the different inquiry committees, all the scandals on taxation. Now we have the Tax 3 following up on Panama Papers and Paradise Papers. And we're trying to make that link, but we see that people try a lot to, invest in the complexity, we told, to indeed keep the opacity. And that's why the work done by Transparency International Global, with this Publish What We Pay, and so many other investigative journalists, of course, the work done by Tom Burgess is really, really very important for us. And I can only say I'm here to hear and learn from you, and I'm sorry that no more of my colleagues are here, but we keep on trusting those who have steered this process, like Sergio and Pascal, to make sure that what we discuss here today is imparted to other colleagues and will be translated into action. Thank you.
Grazie. Adesso chi di voi vuole parlare? Prego. Prego.
I just had a short follow-up question, more like a procedural question to Mr. Deckers. Basically, you said that the results of fitness check won't be the need to legislate change in the decision of the next commission. I just wanted to ask whether, after the end of this review process, when you will be publishing your reporting document, will the current EC also propose recommendations, potential recommendations to the next commission, or will it just present findings in a neutral way, or exactly have suggestions on whether to improve it at a later stage or to keep it as it is?
Thank you. I actually need to clarify, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because we're doing a fitness check, and as you mentioned, the result of the fitness check is a staff working document in which there can be no political commitments. So on that side, it's very clear. Nevertheless, I did mention also that we have a number of review clauses or reporting obligations in several pieces of legislation, including on Chapter 10 of the Accounting Directive. And we will, or we intend to adopt at the same time as we publish the fitness check, also a communication to try to report, to just formally respond to those reporting obligations that we have. Now, given that this is likely to be adopted quite late in the mandate of the current Commission, I would be surprised, but it's a personal opinion, I would be surprised if that communication undertook wide-ranging political commitments, because it would be for the next Commission to see how it wishes to follow up. Nevertheless, if there is a need to address specific points that are particularly urgent, then that would be perhaps an opportunity to do that. But I would expect if there are any specific forward-looking recommendations in that communication, that they would be rather targeted and specific, and that we would not, in that communication, announce major political initiatives. Again, mainly because it will arrive very late in the mandate of the current college, and I would suspect that the college will not want at that stage to undertake political commitments on which it cannot deliver, because it will have to be the next college that does that.
Grazie.
Merci beaucoup. Vous m'entendez?
Ça marche maintenant?
Je vais changer mon micro. Bonjour. Merci beaucoup. Quentin Parinello, je travaille pour l'ONG Oxfam France et je coordonne également les activités de la coalition Publication Payée en France. Je voulais rebondir sur les propos de Madame la députée Anna Gomez et notamment dans le contexte du Niger. J'ai eu l'opportunité et la chance de travailler avec Ali Dexan, dont je salue le travail au Niger dans un contexte toujours plus difficile. J'ai eu l'opportunité de travailler avec lui notamment sur l'analyse des paiements d'Areva, entreprise minière française qui vient de changer de nom et qui s'appelle désormais Orano, à la suite d'une renégociation de contrat. C'est le travail notamment qu'on a pu fournir qui a démontré que Areva payait à la suite de la renégociation moins d'argent au Niger qu'avant la renégociation, pour une renégociation qui avait été annoncée par les deux parties comme étant une renégociation gagnant-gagnant. Au-delà de l'analyse technique que l'on a pu faire, je voulais vraiment rebondir sur la question de l'espace dédié à la société civile. Cette analyse a été basée sur des faits, mais ces faits n'ont pas forcément pu être discutés du fait de la perception de la société civile au Niger. Et ça s'étend sur deux aspects. Le premier, c'est simplement, effectivement, comme on disait, l'espace de la société civile, donc la possibilité de s'exprimer sans finir en prison. On peut avoir la meilleure analyse de données au monde. Si lorsqu'on ouvre la bouche, on finit dans un cachot, ça pose de réels problèmes. Et le deuxième, peut-être un peu plus complexe, mais toujours intéressant, c'est la question de la légitimité de la société civile à s'exprimer sur ces sujets. Quand bien même il n'y a pas de pression sur la liberté même, mais la possibilité, la légitimité de la société civile de se positionner sur des questions de gouvernance, de budget, de transparence. Parce que dans beaucoup de pays, le cas du Niger est une excellente illustration, lorsque la société civile s'exprime sur ces sujets, il y a souvent une violence des termes sur le fait que la société civile serait politisée, aurait un agenda politique, alors simplement qu'elle exerce son droit à rendre des comptes. Lorsque les directives ont été votées, la théorie de changement, si vous voulez, et je pense qu'on a tous dit, c'était que la transparence pouvait aider la société civile à s'armer pour demander des comptes au gouvernement. On est tous d'accord que la transparence, ce n'est pas assez, et il y a un véritable rôle que doit avoir l'Union européenne dans la protection de l'espace civique et dans le renforcement de la légitimité de la société civile, des organisations de la société civile, à pouvoir continuer à s'exprimer. Et c'est comme ça qu'on pourra finalement donner vie à ces analyses qu'on fait et avoir un vrai suivi au niveau local de la part des organisations qui travaillent sur ces sujets. Je vous remercie.
Prego.
Hi, Dominic Eagleton from the NGO Global Witness. We campaign against corruption in the natural resource industry, and we were kind of played a central role in advocating for the establishment of the payment transparency rules. Just very quickly, another contribution that we've made recently is a handbook for using the data. So we published this handbook just a few weeks ago. It's there to help people, anybody, use the data. And we want to encourage people to do that and to show that actually, if you have an internet connection and a little bit of spare time, you can use the data to hold companies and governments to account. There's 10 different methodologies for using the data that we highlight in the handbook. Each one of those methodologies includes case studies, so real-life case studies of using the EU data, just showing that it's possible to do this. So we hope that's a valuable contribution. Just very briefly, what it gets to is this whole thing about if we can calculate how much we think a company should be paying to the government. It shows you the handbook shows you how to do this. Then we can compare that our own estimate with what the company actually paid. So that's the kind of principle behind the handbook. So just a quick mention about a contribution that Bill Witness has made to try and encourage whoever it is, civil society activists, parliamentarians, journalists, whoever it is, to use the data. Thank you.
Grazie a lei. L'ultimo intervento.
Hi, Joe Williams from the Natural Resource Governance Institute. Thanks for the very rich discussion and for hosting this event. I really want to sort of come back a little bit to some of the things Tom Burgess was talking about. And my reflection on this piece of legislation is that it's a critical, necessary tool, but it's insufficient to address everything that we're talking about. So, but getting this particular tool right, which is actually a very simple tool if you think about it. It is the very legitimate question that a citizen has of its own government to say, how much did you receive for selling the resources that belong to me according to the constitution of the country? So this piece of legislation really helps citizens to answer that very legitimate question on a resource that they own. James Royston kindly referred to the website resourceprojects.org that NRGI has been putting together. It to some extent tries to answer this question of lack of accessibility of these reports, and we spend a lot of time and effort trying to locate the reports. Do you know there are some member states which charge you to access the reports? Now, that's not a very useful tool for a citizen in Niger or elsewhere to try and access the data. So, we try to collate the data together. But as James said, ultimately, I think this is the responsibility of the Commission or the member states to make this accessible to everyone. We'll have a report coming out later this year, which will show how many payments have been made by these companies globally. We're including Canada as well in this because it's a joint effort. And at the moment, we're at $533 billion paid to over 100 countries. So it's really adding more information into the public domain than we ever had before. It's very interesting, I think, to note that the majority of payments go to non-EITI countries. So EITI is a fantastic initiative, but the majority of natural resource extraction takes place outside of EITI countries. So what you have done with this European directive is you're putting information into the hands of those who don't have it through the voluntary EITI initiative. And indeed, even within the EITI family, you have countries like Equatorial Guinea, the United States, Azerbaijan, Niger, which used to be part of EITI, but have decided that actually they don't want to be part of EITI anymore. So this legislation gives a continuity of access to company information if they're registered in Canada, the European Union, or the EEA. And the final point I want to make is there is a very big payment which is missing from the legislation, and James referred to it, and that is payments essentially to national oil companies for the purchase of oil and gas in countries like Libya, Angola, Nigeria. These are the biggest payments that those governments are receiving. Much bigger than taxes, much bigger than royalties. and they're currently missing from the legislation, and we really think this needs to be addressed.
Grazie, non era l'ultimo, in verità è il penultimo, perché vorrei dare la parola a chi l'ha chiesto qui di fronte a noi. Ringrazio i nostri interpreti che si sono resi disponibili a fermarsi ancora qualche minuto per aiutare il nostro lavoro. Prego.
Merci beaucoup pour l'organisation de cet événement. Je voulais juste rappeler effectivement qu'ici il a été question beaucoup des progrès qui ont été faits dans l'industrie extractive, mais de rappeler également que cette directive cible l'exploitation forestière et que malheureusement on ne peut pas signaler beaucoup de progrès a priori au regard de l'exploitation forestière. Juste rappeler peut-être certainement les principaux obstacles aujourd'hui rencontrés pour que cette directive puisse fonctionner aussi pour l'exploitation forestière. Comme il a été rappelé par M. Ducoulombier, l'un des premiers obstacles, c'est le fait que ça se limite à l'exploitation forestière dans les forêts primaires. Outre la difficulté que dans certains pays, les forêts primaires sont quasiment inexistantes aujourd'hui, comme par exemple au Ghana ou en Côte d'Ivoire, il est aussi certainement beaucoup plus utile de se référer aux endroits où il est possible de faire de l'exploitation forestière en application des lois des pays producteurs et qui très souvent eux-mêmes ne vont pas inclure les forêts primaires dans les catégories de forêts dédiées à l'exploitation forestière. Deuxièmement, il a été rappelé au moment des consultations qu'on a fait pour répondre à des consultations de la Commission qu'on a fait en République du Congo, Libéria, Côte d'Ivoire et Ghana auprès de la société civile, que les entreprises qui font de l'exploitation forestière ne rentrent pas forcément dans la catégorie qui est aujourd'hui ciblée des très grandes compagnies, qu'il peut s'agir plutôt de moyennes entreprises, et aussi de se rappeler de l'usage des sous-traitants, même si évidemment pour les paiements au gouvernement, il peut y avoir des difficultés à ce niveau-là. Et enfin, les deux derniers points qui nous ont souvent été signalés lors des consultations qu'on a menées, ce sont le niveau de paiement, le seuil de paiement de 100 000 € qui apparaît trop élevé pour l'exploitation forestière. Et enfin, je rappellerai également, concernant l'exploitation des forêts, qu'il y a évidemment la coupe de bois classique, la coupe de bois sélective, mais qu'il y a aujourd'hui cette difficulté de l'expansion agricole et donc de toutes les compagnies, par exemple d'agrobusiness, qui viennent défricher les forêts et de voir dans quelle mesure on pourrait essayer d'élargir les différentes l'exploitation forestière, mais aussi ne pas oublier l'expansion agricole qui aujourd'hui sont responsables de la déforestation. Je crois que j'ai complètement oublié de dire qui j'étais. Donc, je m'appelle Clotilde Henriot, je suis juriste pour l'ONG Clienters. Merci beaucoup.
Grazie, Pascal.
Merci beaucoup, Sergio. Je crois que sur des discussions comme ça, il est inutile de conclure. Il est important de relever, d'abord il est important de se parler. Ça fait toujours du bien dans un Parlement européen, ça a été dit par Anna, ça a été dit par Sergio, mais pour nous de pouvoir permettre à des ONG de pouvoir parler directement, aussi avec la Commission. Je sais que des rendez-vous sont souvent organisés, mais là on est dans la transparence. Et puis finalement, il y a une tautologie qui ressort un truisme, mais que sans transparence, c'est l'opacité. Et ça paraît bête de le dire, mais moi ce que je retiens quand même, c'est que cette législation, elle a permis d'ouvrir un débat sur la transparence. On s'est battu avec Sergio dans d'autres commissions pour essayer justement d'avoir le reporting pays par pays, tout simplement dans une volonté de transparence. C'est-à-dire que, et évidemment, quand on entend M. Berekis, quand on entend Ali Dressa, on a parfaitement conscience des difficultés qui existent, de la corruption, des meurtres, de toute la situation au Niger. J'ai honte, en tant que Français évidemment, de ce que l'on fait subir, même si nous n'avons pas de part de responsabilité sur le nucléaire, bien au contraire, mais de ce que l'on fait subir, y compris par la sous-traitance, y compris sur les conditions humaines. On parle de l'exploitation, mais là encore une fois, on sait très bien qu'on a recapitalisé en France Areva à hauteur de 5 milliards. 5 milliards. Et quand on voit les sommes qui, in fine, sont données au Niger, évidemment, elles sont dérisoires à côté de ce que nous mettons. Donc, bon, il y a eu beaucoup de propositions qui ont été faites, qui tournent toutes vers essayer d'avoir une base qui soit uniforme, une base pour les rapports, une base pour la législation, et Et donc je crois que c'est vers cela, j'ai bien entendu ce que disait la Commission. Moi j'ai un problème avec le côté non politique du fitness check, parce que nous savons tous que derrière cette vision administrative, et c'est pas une critique, c'est un constat, cette vision administrative, en réalité, il y a des choix politiques qui sont là, et je comprends bien que ça n'est pas dans le cadre de cette mandature, ni dans celle de la Commission, que nous allons pouvoir avancer, mais je me tourne vers vous, je vous supplie de faire en sorte que la Commission sorte de sa vision qui n'est pas la vôtre, hein, mais de sa vision trop technocratique d'un sujet qui concerne des êtres humains, qui concerne la nature, qui concerne notre avenir commun. Soyons et faisons de la politique sur ces sujets-là, sur ces questions-là. Les ONG le prouvent tous les jours. Aidez les ONG à la transparence. J'ai une pensée également pour les procès, quand vous disiez qu'au Congo, on a pu avancer par un procès en France, là où le Niger ne le fait pas. J'ai une pensée aussi pour mes amis de Sherpa et pour d'autres ONG qui se battent pour faire en sorte que les juridictions, parce que ce sont nos entreprises qui pillent au Niger ou ailleurs, et que nos juridictions puissent sanctionner les sociétés mères et les holdings. C'est un combat que nous menons également. Ça vaut pour la transparence fiscale, ça vaut pour la transparence juridique. Donc voilà, tous ces combats-là sont les combats que nous menons au Parlement européen, et nous vous remercions infiniment du temps que vous avez passé les unes, les uns et les autres à échanger sur cette belle, sur ce bel engagement pour l'avenir. Et puis moi, je me tourne encore une fois vers Sergio pour te remercier d'avoir mis tout cela en place et de m'avoir permis également d'être présent. Voilà. Donc, je vous souhaite maintenant à tous et à toutes une excellente journée. Merci infiniment.